for the gospel? Holy Gospel is according to John. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the Sea of Capernaum to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the gospel of our Lord. Please be seated. Last week, if you recall, those who were here, the gospel was from Mark. And we noticed that there was a gap in the gospel. And I mentioned to people that the gap was the feeding of the 5,000. And that we would take it up this week, the feeding of the 5,000 and the storm, along with Jesus walking on water. However, when we get to John's story of feeding 5,000, it takes on a lot different meaning. For one thing, it's not just the story of feeding the 5,000. For 5 weeks now, we will be reading chapter 6 of John. And there's all kinds of nuances, etc., that come with this story. And I think I've said before, the Gospel of John is so much different than the other 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I like to say that Mark is probably where we see the most human Jesus. And John is the one where we see the most divine Christ. And in between are Matthew and Luke. In John, or in Mark, Jesus begins his ministry, and that's when Mark, the author of Mark, begins the story. In John, if you recall, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then later on, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. All kinds of meanings, all kinds of nuances that go through all of John. I've also said that in the Gospel of John, when you read it, it can be as shallow and safe for a little baby to wade through. But it can be as deep as an elephant getting drowned, because it has so much to say. So I want to share a few differences just to give you an idea. I list them because there's that many. In the Gospel of John, the crowd comes together because they see the signs that Jesus has done for the sick. Now in John, he never uses the word miracle. He uses the word sign instead, because all the miracles point to Jesus and point to God. And people have even called the first 12 chapters of John the book of signs. There's 7 miracles that John reports. Then he goes up a mountain. There's no mountain in the other 3 Gospels. And it's the time of the Passover. In Mark and Luke and Matthew, there's one Passover, just before his Passion. In John, there are 3. And at each one of those, it is a significant message that John is providing. In the first 3 Gospels, Jesus says, you give them something to eat, to the disciples. In this one, he says, where are we going to buy food? And he asks a specific disciple. No specific disciple is mentioned in the others. And then, this divinity of Christ, the comment is made, well, he's just testing Philip because he knows what he's going to do. Andrew brings a boy. And we find out that it's barley bread, which is the least expensive, the cheapest to make for poor people. And in this one, Jesus distributes the food, not the disciples. And they get as much as they wanted. Not what they need, as much as they wanted. And then, something I'm still trying to figure out why Jesus said this, they gather up the fragments of the barley bread so that nothing will be lost. The people identify him as a prophet. Not only a prophet, but the prophet who is to come into the world. And they want, Jesus feels that they want to take him by force and make him king. That's not in the other Gospels. And then after that, they go in the boat, the disciples, on their own, cross over to a destination which is never mentioned in the others, Capernaum. Jesus comes walking on the water, and if you read the text, he never gets in the boat. And it is immediately they come to the shore. Something like a miracle. Now, we do not have enough time to discuss all this. There is so much to it. What I want to do is set the tone and set the stage for us to think about something. John uses metaphors. John uses pictures to give you an idea of what message he's trying to convey. Now, I don't want to challenge the fact that Jesus probably multiplied those loaves and fish. But I want us to think about something else. There were 5,000 people there. Probably more. As Matthew says, 5,000 men, besides the women and children. Now, if you think about those people, you ask yourself, who were they? Well, there probably was some pious Jews there. And pious Jews do not eat with anybody else. They won't even let a Gentile, or what they call a sinner, into their house, because that would be taboo according to the rules and regulations of the law of God. And all the food is properly prepared. We call that kosher. And they still do it today. So if they were going out to be with Jesus, there's a good chance the pious Jews and maybe the Gentiles and the sinners would have brought some food with them. Because they wouldn't want to disobey the law. And here's Jesus, who takes a loaf of barley bread, prays to God, and 5,000 people eat together as one. And nobody goes without food. Now, there's no doubt the miracle would be if he multiplied the bread and the fish. But which miracle would be greater? Jesus doing all the work and multiplying, or the fact that he could pray to God, and because of his presence, 5,000 people who would normally not eat together, would not even associate with each other, would sit down on the grass and come together as a people and share with one another. I leave that answer up to you. But it seems to me that what Jesus is showing is that in the reign of God, it is a rule of abundance. And that if we share with one another, whether it's money or time or the gifts we have or anything, there is enough for all of us. The world says we live in a world of scarcity. And I don't care what nation you're at, whether it's democratic or whether it's a dictatorship or whether it's communistic or whatever, the law of supply and demand says there's scarcity. There's not enough. Now, how do we look at that? And part of it is, how do we look at Jesus? Who is Jesus to us? For you see, the people wanted a king. They wanted somebody to take care of them. They wanted somebody who would provide everything they needed so they would be okay. That they would live in safety and security and get everything they wanted, like David. When Jesus is crossing and walking on water and crossing the Sea of Galilee, and he comes upon his disciples, he says, "It is I." In Greek, that is ego eimi. And what that means is, I am. And that's the name of God. And says, do not be afraid. You know, when you try and look at it from a perspective of abundance versus scarcity, the waters can get a little choppy. The storms can get a little bit scary, in our minds at least. But let's look at Ephesians for a second, where Paul prays that their inner being will be strengthened by the Spirit, and that Christ, who lives in their heart through faith, will provide them to be grounded and rooted in love. And I would like to make a contention that when we come and see life out of love for one another, out of caring for one another, we begin to see the God of abundance. When we look at life from our own perspective, that life is about us, we see life of scarcity. And so we struggle in this human life of ours between those two. And we have to constantly ask ourselves, are we looking for a prophet or a king? Or are we looking for the God who says to us,
Do not be afraid. I am with you.